Then when the war broke out, naturally we were all gathered up, and we spent, about 4 months in Camp Harmony in the Puyallup Fairgrounds. And then from there they shipped us to Hunt, Idaho. It's sort of ironic though, before we were evacuated, or interned I should say, my oldest brother was drafted in the U.S. Army. So he never spent a day in camp. And so there were, and my other brother was in Japan at that time. And so my mother was quite concerned, well, my mother and father were quite concerned with the outbreak of the war, what would happen to him. He was the number 3 son, and he went back to Japan to accompany my grandmother, who had come over from Japan to help my mother during the time I was being born. And then he accompanied my grandmother back to Japan, and my parents, I guess at that time, felt that maybe one of us should be raised in Japan. And so he went to live with my aunt and uncle in Japan. But, so like I said, my brother was drafted before we moved to camp, and here my parents were sort of split. They had 2 sons, one, quote, fighting with the enemy, and the other, quote, fighting for America. And it must have been quite a ordeal for them. And more so that, you know, they had to sell everything, and that was quite traumatic. And like my dad, he was, I would say, a pretty good business person. He ran not only the hotel, but also he had a tavern and a restaurant down in Pioneer Square where the old Maynard building is. And he had quite a bit of money invested in that. And obviously he had to sell his lease or whatever. I never could get quite clear how much he lost, but I'm sure he lost his pants on that thing. And consequently, we ended up in Minadoka, and we spent about, we were about the last ones to leave out of camp, because I remember in August '45, hearing over the radio all the atomic bomb was dropped, and the war was ending, and here we were still in camp. So we left camp, must have been about September of '45, and came back to Seattle. And fortunately, my oldest brother, who was in the Army, who was drafted, his in-laws' friends took care of their house in Seattle. And so when we came back to Seattle, we were able to live with them temporarily while my folks were trying to go house hunting. The other ironic part of it was the oldest brother, who was drafted, became part of the recruiting team that went to various internment camps to try to recruit Japanese Americans who were interned to join in the Army. And that's when the number 2 son volunteered. And it was somewhat, shall we say, heart-rending to my folks to see the oldest son recruiting the number 2 son to join in the Army. And eventually, the number 2 son, Yosh, ended up with the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, and he was killed in southern France, rescuing that lost battalion. You know, that great battle that the 442nd had.